Welcome back to my channel. This is Sacred Scars Unbroken Spirit, and I am writing a book based off of my life story that will be available at a later date. So this is part 2 of delving into my family dynamic. To catch you all up, we left off talking about the dysfunctional aspects between my mother and I's relationship. How she would take my power from me, remove important medications that I needed just to spite me. She would micromanage me at work. And from there, it just the relationship really went downhill. Now, I had no idea that these things were just the beginning of what eventually would turn into a now book-worthy healing journey of mass scale. I truly didn't realize that what was planted and ingrained in my childhood was about to have a ripple effect on all of my life experiences, molding and shaping my reality as I grew up. Non-stop battles. It really felt like a never-ending cosmic beatdown from the universe, just constantly getting kicked in the teeth over and over and over. Just these back-to-back traumas, often continuing to still get kicked while I was already down. But I always got back up, of course. So when I was 23, I started dancing in the strip club to make some extra money to support myself. I was able to hide it very well until I was about 26. One day, while I was working at my mom's office, one of her patients unfortunately snitched on me. Apparently, I had sat down and chatted with the gentleman at his table the previous weekend while I was working in the club. It never dawned on me that he was one of my mother's patients, and sure enough, he came in for his appointment the next week and told my mother that the front desk girl, me, was a stripper. So this is where my mother and I's relationship really began going downhill. Her strong Christian values made her see me in a disgraceful light. For lack of a better term, she basically disowned me for many years after. There have been many occasions where she has said straight to my face, "You're not my daughter." Okay. Now, to be clear, when I started dancing, I knew exactly what I was getting myself into and the very great lengths I would have had to go through in order to keep that part of my life hidden. Not only from my family, but my entire circle, as I was very active in my community, school, things like that. I could not risk anyone finding out, for obvious reasons, what I was doing. My fear of the repercussions led me to lead essentially a double life. I wasn't so naive to think I'd never get caught. It was always just a matter of when in the back of my mind. But nevertheless, my mother's reaction to finding out that her straight A, star athlete, goody two shoes daughter was doing the unthinkable. And just like that, with the switch of a button, I went from being her beautiful, bright, smart little girl, her pride and joy one minute, to this despicable whore the next, amongst other things. And from that point on, she never let me live it down. She was constantly projecting her shame and disgust onto me. It basically was her own insecurities and guilt trips, fears of what people would think about her, her own reputation, things like that. It really went on relentlessly for the next 10 or so years of my life. So during those 10 years, from the moment she found out I was dancing, her attitude and demeanor towards me completely flipped. She was treating me differently, not speaking to me like she used to, if at all, for the first year or so. And it was very obvious to me that at this point my mother had checked out as far as being my parent. And as such, this of course was a little bit difficult to process at first. I mean, especially with everything that was happening, it was happening all so fast and all at once. So with that, the mental and emotional aspect, on top of the nonstop fights she would pick day in and day out, it had like a domino effect. One thing after another would cause her impulsive, knee-jerk reactions, creating even more conflict between us. So, no matter how much I tried to avoid her, avoid being home at the same time as her, etc., etc., it still had a snowball effect. This snowball effect was inevitable, and it continuously built into a raging downward spiral, bringing us deeper and deeper into separation. This progressed on long enough to really exacerbate and create even more chaos within the entire family. Going so far as manipulating my dad into taking sides, her side, of course, and ultimately leading me to becoming the scapegoat of the family. Because now it just wasn't my mother I was having to defend myself and my son against. It was now my dad also. I was getting, he was getting dragged into this mess as initially as the mediator, but needless to say, that didn't last very long. My dad has always been very quick to take my mother's side no matter what, even if she's in the wrong. And so, with that being said, to basically summarize the energy of this household I was living in, it grew exponentially much more toxic than it already was, if that's even possible. But like I said, I was already living this daily nightmare in a toxic, unhealthy home environment with my narcissistic mother. My whole life was already filled with CPTSD from the constant verbal abuse and so on and so forth. Now my battle was against two already toxic parents in an abusive household, the attacks now coming from both sides every time my mom picked a fight with me. I now had to stand up to two angles of everyone yelling, belittling me, name calling, so on and so forth. And eventually, of course, all of my points of views weren't being heard. They were ultimately all shut down. My mother has always been very reactive and unpredictable as long as I can remember growing up. She always had a short fuse, and depending on her mood or the kind of day that she had, she could be very easily triggered. I always had to walk on eggshells around her, as when she did become triggered and start to pick a fight, it could very, very, very quickly become explosive. That wasn't good. There have been many instances where she had picked fights with me for no reason at all, or I would be minding my own business and one little comment, just one little thing, would turn into an explosive fight. This was not uncommon at all. During these fights, she would unleash all of this bottled up resentment she was holding on to. A lot of these things often having absolutely nothing to do with the situation at hand that we were arguing about. Sometimes the fights would go on for hours. Sometimes it was shorter, but at the end of the day, it all kind of ended the same. I mean, she would call me all these nasty, derogatory names, every horrible thing you can think of in the book. It just would depend on the situation and her mood. Like I said, ultimately, no matter the intensity, these fights all ended the same way, with both of us not speaking for days, if not longer. Another one of the more frustrating aspects about my mother is the mask that she wears. She often puts on a front when in the public eye, if that makes sense. She portrays an image that she has it all together, but she very much does not. The real issue is she acts one way in front of other people, but she has another side of her that no one else sees. No one except those like close family living with her. No one sees this monstrous side of her that comes out when she gets angry. Nobody sees the vindictive and spiteful behaviors done to the very ones that she also claims to love. It's very contradictory. Her very own family, children, husband, even her grandson has unfortunately been a victim of her anger and rage also. Excuse me. My mother and I have always had sort of a power struggle dynamic. For instance, it's commonly known that a narcissist will only acknowledge their own values of what they've done for you tenfold versus anything you do for them, right? Well, in my case, my contributions have been essentially erased, or at least didn't carry the same value. She only ever saw her contribution to the relationship. It was very, very one-sided. In fact, is so much that I have done for her that she doesn't even know about. I don't seek the same validation that she does for doing something good. I just do it freely with no strings, because there's no strings attached. I always give freely from my heart with no expectation of anything in return. That's just how I am. I constantly am protecting her through spiritual means, praying over her, so on and so forth. I've even gone as far as paying for a healing session for her when she was in a really dark place that she refused to even show up for. That's how far she was willing to go, to refuse to acknowledge, her actions and her destructive behaviors. The list goes on and on, but in retrospect, she was also always keeping tabs, tallying every little thing she has done for me so that she could hold it over my head or use it against me one day. To this day, I am constantly living with this fear in the back of my mind of accepting anything from her, money, even help with watching my son. I am just constantly riddled with this fear that she will eventually one day use these things against me, or, it might give her a reason to call me a crappy mom, when in all actuality, that is the farthest from the truth. I do everything in my power to this day to protect my son and ensure that he never ever has to grow up dealing with these same traumas that my mother has raised me under. To further describe the authoritative power struggle dynamic between my mother and I, growing up, I developed a major people-pleasing tendencies, and I was the biggest pushover. These tendencies stemmed from the fear instilled in me of what punishment I might face if I didn't bow down to her control mechanisms, her rules, the fear of making her mad, as well as, in retrospect, the desire to please her and make her happy so that I would receive love. As mentioned earlier, her love was very much conditional and had to be earned through performance and excelling. Excelling academically, excelling athletically, you name it. And in doing what I was told, basically. Her control mechanisms were used as leverage when it came to receiving any sort of praise, any sort of recognition for my achievements, etc., etc. Over time, as I got older, I began to resent feeling like such a weak person. So I felt so powerless, without a backbone to stick up for myself. And as such, I then decided to make the necessary changes to take my power back and stand up to her. Now, this did not go well from the start, because I'm the first person to take that stand and confront her when I was in disagreement with her controlling ways. I was the only one who had the courage to address her issues and bring these things to light, thus forcing her to take a very deep look at herself and her destructive behaviors. I was the only one to show her how her actions and verbal abuse were creating such a toxic relationship between us. So it goes without saying, her animosity toward me, it only got worse once she realized she couldn't manipulate or control me anymore. And of course, once I got older, I learned how to say no. I eventually did stop people pleasing. I learned how to take my power back. I learned how to stand up for myself and how to say no to her without this lingering fear or harboring any feelings of guilt. Boy, did this level of growth / newfound confidence I had developed, it stirred up something in her that clearly she had never dealt with before. You see, my mother was used to everyone around her always being compliant and agreeable. But the reality is, more often than not, it was simply a matter of others just wanting to keep the peace and avoid conflict. But I was no longer willing to perpetuate this vicious cycle of toxicity. I no longer would enable her to continue treating me like her freaking emotional punching bag, you know? I no longer was going to stand for her verbal abuse, her belittling me, name calling both to my face and behind my back, her constant knee-jerk reactions, threats to kick me out of the house every little fight we had. Even worse, the petty fighting was almost an everyday thing. She always found something to pick a fight about, no matter how much I kept to myself, no matter how much I isolated, stayed in my room, mostly while she was home. Still, it wasn't enough. These explosive fights were almost inevitable, and oftentimes it ended with threats to put me and my son out on the street, even though having done absolutely nothing to deserve such extreme, punishment measures. Spite Spite seemed to always be her go-to when in the heat of the moment. Anything to hurt me or cause severe upheaval in my already struggle-filled life. I'd even go as far as saying that she enjoyed kicking me while I was already down. It made her feel good to one-up me, like she was in some kind of like some sort of weird competition with me. It's the craziest thing. And of course, in true narcissist fashion, she always had to have the last word and win at all costs, of course. So it goes without saying that this did indeed further exacerbate her resentment toward me, because for the first time, she was confronted instead of enabled. She was forced to take a look at her actions and how hurtful they were. By me standing up to her and addressing these toxic behaviors, she no longer was able to sweep it under the rug or hide from accountability. It just wasn't going to happen anymore. So, whilst communicating and voicing my concerns seemed like the best thing to do in order for us to come to a place of resolution amidst our conflict in day-to-day life, my hope was that she would take this awareness and make the necessary changes so that we could possibly start to begin to repair our relationship. Or so I thought. Unfortunately, deep down, I knew something like that would never happen. Wishful thinking at best. And as expected, my efforts to open up a healthy dialogue ended up inciting the complete opposite. Angry, rage-fueled fights, completely rejecting and dismissing my concerns, denial, deflection, absolutely no accountability whatsoever. If anything, the fights were even more foul and explosive because now she was feeling like she was being personally attacked. And of course, she was unwilling to zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture. So, needless to say, she very much was never going to consider her part in these destructive, hurtful situations. And of course, my intention was never to attack, just to bring these things to light, awareness, 100%. But she was, like I said, 100% set in her ways, set in her views, and it became clear that any effort to get her to work on herself, to regulate her anger, to quit picking petty fights, quit making threats to take me out of the will or throw me and my son out of the house, the yelling, the screaming, the name calling, she just was in complete denial. And in fact, it was always somehow my fault one way or another, regardless. So, as such, the only logical solution, the only logical way to move forward was to ultimately protect my peace and just set really strong, healthy boundaries. Slowly, I started to begin the process of going no contact, or at least as best I could while still living in the same household as her. I eventually was able to move out and strictly limited her visits with my son as well. After taking those measures, the peace we both felt finally being out of that toxic environment was just indescribable. For the very first time in my life, I finally felt safe and I could breathe. I was no longer in fight or flight. Now, looking back, I've come to understand just how strong and resilient I truly am today. And as much as it has sucked, hindsight is 20/20, and I can say for sure now that I am so grateful for it all. Because in the end, I only came out on top, stronger than before. My scars are now sacred. My spirit can never be broken. So, that about wraps up this 2-part series delving into the traumas I've experienced with my narcissistic mother. I want to thank you all for following me on this journey. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my uploads. Thank you again for all of your support, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!